The windmill started complaining before sunrise. At first, it was only a dry scrape above the roofline, a metal-on-metal complaint that rose and fell with the weak desert wind. By 7 o'clock, it had become a full-throated shriek. Clara Whitlock stood in the yard with one hand over her eyes, staring up at the crooked tower while a galvanized water pail bumped against her knee. The blades were barely moving. That meant the trough would be empty before noon. She set down the pail, wiped her palms on the sides of her work skirt, and climbed. The iron rungs were already hot. Red dust had packed itself into the joints of the tower, mixing with old grease until every hinge felt as though it had been filled with ground glass. Clara climbed past the roof of the house, past the cottonwood that had lost half its leaves to drought, past the point where any sensible person would have stopped and waited for help. There was no help. There had not been for years. At the hub, she hooked one arm through the frame and leaned into the seized bolt with a wrench. The first pull did nothing. The second sent a tremor through the tower. The third tore skin from the base of her thumb. She looked at the bright bead of blood gathering there, pressed it absently against her skirt, and tried again. The bolt gave with a crack. The blades lurched. The pump rod shuddered below. After several uncertain strokes, water began knocking through the pipe toward the holding tank. Clara rested her forehead against the warm iron and closed her eyes. For a few seconds, the sound of the pump was enough. Then she saw the riders. 2 men came down from the northern ridge at an easy pace, raising a pale rope of dust behind them. The first rode a polished bay that looked better fed than most families in the valley. The second sat a tired chestnut mare and wore a deputy's badge. Clara stayed where she was until they reached the gate. Silas Vance looked up at her and smiled. Even from 40 feet above the ground, she could see the confidence in that smile. "Careful up there," he called. "Would be unfortunate if the property lost its last occupant before the paperwork was finished." Clara came down slowly, not because she feared him, but because anger made her hands less dependable than the wind. By the time her boots touched the yard, Deputy Elias Miller had dismounted. He removed his hat, though not out of courtesy. He was sweating. He always sweated around Silas. Silas stayed in the saddle. He reached into his coat and brought out a leather-bound ledger. "Territorial assessment records," he said. "You are in arrears. 3 years of missed productivity requirements, 2 unpaid improvement levies, and no surviving deed on file in Tucson. As of yesterday, your north acreage has been declared abandoned." Clara looked at the book, then at him. "Yesterday? That is what the date says. My cattle were grazing there yesterday." Silas shrugged. "Cattle wander. My father filed that land before you had whiskers. Then I am sure you will have no trouble proving it." He opened the ledger and showed her a page filled with neat black lines. Clara could read well enough. Her father had insisted on that before he taught her how to rope a calf or repair a pump. She saw the Whitlock name. She saw numbers. She saw a signature that looked almost like her father's. Almost. Her chest tightened. The final entry was too fresh. The ink held a faint shine where the rest of the page had gone brown with age. This was written recently. Silas's smile did not move. Paper is paper. No, old ink sinks. New ink sits. Deputy Miller shifted beside the mare. Silas closed the ledger. "The notice goes up today. You have until sunset tomorrow to vacate the house, well, outbuildings, and pasture. Anything left behind becomes part of the claim." Clara stared at him. He leaned forward in the saddle. "You should take what matters." His horse stepped into the little line of damp soil where Clara had planted onions beside the porch. One polished hoof crushed 3 green shoots into the mud. She looked down at them. Then she looked back at Silas. "If you come here after sunset tomorrow," she said, "bring more men." Deputy Miller flinched. Silas laughed once. "Still your father's daughter?" "No," Clara said. "Just the only Whitlock you failed to scare off." For the first time, the smile left his face. He turned his horse and rode out. Miller followed without speaking. Clara waited until the dust settled before bending over the crushed onions. She lifted one of the green stems between 2 fingers. It was split near the root but not severed. She pressed the soil back around it. Inside the house, the ledger smell seemed to have followed her. Old paper, leather. Ink. Her kitchen was a plain room built for work, a cast iron stove, a square pine table, 4 mismatched chairs even though only one had been used for supper in years. A coffee pot sat on the stove, burned black around the bottom. 2 biscuits from the previous night rested under a cloth near the flour tin. Clara poured coffee and did not drink it. She opened the copy of the notice Miller had left behind. The language was formal enough to hide a hanging inside it, abandoned parcel, non-productive claim, failure to establish legal continuity. She read each phrase twice. Then she went to the small desk in the front room and began pulling out drawers. She found seed invoices, old tax receipts, a letter from her mother's sister in Missouri, a veterinary bill from 8 years earlier, and 3 pages of her father's handwriting about the depth of the north well. No deed. She checked the cedar chest in the bedroom. Blankets. Her mother's lace collar. A pair of men's gloves that had belonged to her father. Under them, wrapped in a faded blue handkerchief, lay a small wooden bird. Clara stopped moving. The bird fit in her palm. It had a blunt beak, a narrow body, and 2 wings cut by an impatient child with more determination than skill. One wing bore a chip along the edge. She ran her thumb over it. 15 years fell away without permission. She was 10 again, sitting barefoot by the creek under the cottonwoods while Jacob Blackwood scraped curls of cedar from a block of wood with his father's knife. "You made the head too big," she had said. "It needs room for songs. Birds don't keep songs in their heads." Where do they keep them? She had considered that seriously. In their throats. He had looked down at the crooked bird. "Then this one has a strong neck." She laughed so hard she fell sideways into the grass. That was before the men came, before the night of smoke, before Jacob's family was driven from their cabin at the edge of the valley and pushed into a line of wagons, horses, frightened children, and armed men moving toward the mountains. Clara remembered finding him behind her father's barn while the column waited on the road. Jacob's face had been streaked with soot. There was a fresh scar near his left temple from the hayloft fall the summer before. He had shoved the wooden bird into her hand. "Keep it. You keep it. I'll make another." She had known he was lying. Not about the bird. About having another chance. He had held out his hand. She took it. "I'll come back," he said. She had tried not to cry because he was trying not to. "To the creek? To your porch? When?" "When I can. What if it takes forever?" Jacob squeezed her fingers. "Then don't let anybody move the porch." She had spent 15 years doing exactly that. Clara closed her hand around the bird until the wood pressed hard into her palm. A knock came from the kitchen. She slipped the lark into her apron pocket and went to the door. Sarah Finch stood outside, holding a loaf of bread wrapped in flour sackcloth. Sarah lived 3 miles south and had the sensible habit of never arriving empty-handed. She was a small woman with sun-browned skin and fingers stained blue from the indigo dye she used at the mercantile. "I heard," Sarah said. "Everybody heard. Silas makes sure of that." Clara moved aside. Sarah entered, put the bread on the table, and noticed the eviction notice. Her mouth tightened. "They say cavalry is coming up from Huachuca tomorrow." Clara looked at her. "For what?" "Land hearings, water disputes, reservation boundaries, anything men can turn into a fight when there isn't enough rain. Silas will like that. He already does. He sent whiskey to their camp." Clara gave a humorless laugh. Sarah rubbed her blue fingers against her skirt. "There's something else." Clara waited. An interpreter is riding with them. There are always interpreters. This one lived with the Chiricahua for years. Some say he was taken as a boy. Some say he stayed by choice. Town has already given him a name. Clara's face hardened. Town gives names to anything it's afraid of. Sarah nodded. "They call him the White Apache." The word should have meant nothing. They did not. Clara looked toward the bedroom. The wooden lark seemed suddenly heavier in her pocket. "What is his real name?" she asked. Sarah hesitated. "Nobody knows. Army calls him Taze." Clara looked at the eviction notice again. She told herself the sudden pressure beneath her ribs was foolishness. There had been thousands of boys lost to war, raids, forced marches, disease, and plain bad luck. Jacob Blackwood was one of them. A promise made at 10 years old did not survive 15 Arizona summers. But that night, she moved the lamp to the front window before going to bed. She had not done that in years. The next morning, she rode into San Pedro with the forged notice folded inside her coat. The town consisted of one hard-packed street, a mercantile, a blacksmith, a church that leaned in the wind, a saloon that did not, and the deputy's office with its whitewashed front already turning yellow from dust. Elias Miller sat behind his desk, polishing his badge. Clara did not sit. "The dates are wrong," she said. Miller kept polishing. "The transfer entry was added later. The signature isn't my father's. The ink is new." Miller raised his head slowly. "Clara, no, look at me." "He did, briefly. You knew my father. I knew everybody's father. You watched him file that claim. I was a boy. You were old enough to remember." He set the rag down. Silas has stamps from Tucson. Stamps can be bought. Careful. Why? You going to arrest me for noticing? Miller leaned back in his chair. You think I like this? I don't care if you like it. His jaw tightened. Clara put both hands on the desk. I care whether you do your job. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking wall clock and a mule braying somewhere outside. Miller looked at the badge in his hand. Then he pinned it back on. Silas has a territorial claim. The army is coming to keep order. If you turn this into a fight, they'll remove you by force. So that is your answer. My answer is to pack. Clara stood straight. You polish that star every morning? Miller frowned. Yes. Maybe one day it'll shine bright enough for you to see yourself in it. She walked out before he could respond. A crowd had gathered near the mercantile. Silas stood beneath the awning smoking a cigar and talking to 3 ranchers Clara recognized. Sarah was behind the counter inside, pretending to sort nails while listening. Silas saw Clara and raised his voice. Army's bringing an interpreter who spent half his life with the Apaches. Imagine that. A man forgets who he belongs to long enough, he starts believing he belongs nowhere. One of the ranchers laughed uneasily. Another said, You trust him? Trust? Silas blew smoke into the street. I trust a rattlesnake to be a rattlesnake. Clara stopped. Silas smiled at her. Heard you were asking questions about ink. Heard you were buying whiskey for soldiers. The men under the awning went quiet. Silas took the cigar from his mouth. Hospitality. You should try it on neighbors sometime. His smile thinned. Clara untied her mare and rode home. By noon, the sky north of the ranch had turned the color of smoke. Not a storm, dust. A long column was moving down from the ridge. Clara stood beside the stone well and watched the riders separate from the haze one by one. Blue cavalry coats, pack horses, a wagon, scouts riding on the flanks. There were more men than any land hearing required. The horses smelled of sweat before they reached the yard. The officer in front raised a hand and the column slowed. A rider detached from the scouts and came toward the well on a dun horse. He wore buckskin under a dark military coat. His hair was longer than army fashion allowed. His face was lean and deeply browned by the sun, the angles hard enough that Clara would not have recognized him. Then he spoke. The lieutenant asks permission to water the stock. The voice reached somewhere inside her before the words did. Clara's fingers tightened on the well rope. The man watched her without expression. The next spring is dry, he added. We can pay for what we use. Clara swallowed. Water isn't something I charge a thirsty horse for. His eyes shifted briefly to the trough. Thank you. He turned his horse to signal the soldiers. Clara said, Wait. He paused. The wind pushed the brim of his hat up. A pale scar cut across his left temple. The rope slipped from Clara's hand. The bucket struck the stone wall of the well, spilling half its water into the dust. The rider looked down at it, then back at her. For 1 second his face changed. Not much, only the smallest break in the stillness around his eyes, but Clara saw him. The boy in the soot, the boy beneath the cottonwoods, the boy who had told her not to let anyone move the porch. She could not breathe. Jacob? The man's jaw tightened. Behind him, soldiers were approaching. His expression closed again. He turned in the saddle. To the troughs, he called to the column. He did not answer her. That hurt more than if he had denied the name. The army made camp on the lower pasture. By afternoon, a canvas awning had been raised beside the wagon, and a folding table stood beneath it. Officers brought maps. Ranchers arrived from neighboring properties. Silas came in a clean coat and polished boots. Jacob sat behind the table with a thick leather ledger opened in front of him. Clara stood in line with everyone else. When her turn came, Jacob dipped a steel pen into the inkwell. Did not look up. Name? Her throat tightened. You know my name. His pen stopped for less than a second. Then he lifted his eyes. There was warning in them. Not rejection. Warning Clara understood. If he knew her openly, Silas would say the interpreter was biased before any evidence was heard. She straightened. Clara Whitlock. Jacob wrote it down. Property in dispute? North Ridge, well, house, barn, and adjoining pasture. Basis of claim? My father's homestead grant. Filed before I was born. Document? Missing. Silas gave a soft laugh from behind her. Jacob's face did not change. He wrote one more line. Witness statement received. Silas stepped forward before Clara had moved away. These horses need to be moved, he said, gesturing toward the scouts' animals tied near the water. They're fouling my well. Clara turned. My well. Silas ignored her. Jacob set down the pen. The horses are placed under Colonel Pearson's order. Silas stared at him. I don't care whose order. I don't want those animals near my water. Jacob looked at the open ledger. Then he picked up the pen and held it toward Silas. "Say that again." Silas blinked. "What?" Slowly. The nearby soldiers had gone quiet. Jacob's voice remained calm. "I will record your objection exactly as you state it, including whose animals you mean, whose water you claim, and why you believe the colonel's order does not apply to you." Silas looked at the page. For the first time since Clara had known him, he seemed uncertain what words might cost. Jacob waited. The silence did the work. Silas stepped back. "We'll discuss it later." Jacob returned the pen to the inkwell. "No," he said, "we won't." That evening, after the hearing ended and the soldiers settled around their fires, Clara carried a bucket to the well, though the kitchen pail was already full. She found Jacob waiting in the shadow of the barn. Neither spoke at first. Crickets had started in the dry grass. Somewhere in camp a horse stamped against a picket rope. The moon had not yet risen, and the valley was the deep blue that comes only for a few minutes between heat and darkness. Clara reached into her pocket. She held out the wooden lark. Jacob stared at it. His face went completely still. "You left this," she said. He did not touch it. "Jacob, that name belongs to a boy who did not survive the mountains." Clara's hand remained extended. "Then who is standing in my yard?" "The army calls me Taze. I asked who you are." His eyes lifted to hers. The darkness around them seemed to tighten. Someone who learned to live after Jacob Blackwood stopped being useful. Clara closed her fingers around the lark. "You were 10. I was old enough. For what? To learn that names don't stop ropes, papers don't stop fire, promises don't stop men with guns." She stepped closer. "This one stopped you from forgetting." His gaze dropped to the bird. The muscles in his jaw shifted. Clara held it out again. "You told me you would come back to my porch. I came back. Then look at it." "I am looking." "No, look at me." He did. For a long time neither moved. Finally, Jacob reached for the lark. His hand trembled, only once. But Clara felt it when the wood passed from her palm into his. He turned it over and touched the chipped wing. "I didn't do that. The winter of '81. It fell from the mantel." "You kept it on the mantel?" "Until the roof leaked. Then I put it in the cedar chest." Jacob ran his thumb across the old knife marks. "I thought about this bird in every place I couldn't leave." Clara said nothing. He looked toward the army camp. "The colonel thinks I'm here to translate land disputes. That is part of it. And the rest." Jacob reached into the satchel at his side and removed the ledger he had used all afternoon. "This is not only translations." He opened it. Pages of tight handwriting filled the book. Names, dates, water sources, cattle brands, military purchases, boundary descriptions, sketches of ridges and springs, copies of testimony in several hands and languages. "I started keeping records because I watched too many people lose land to words they couldn't read." Clara touched the edge of a page. "You've been tracking claims, payments, relocations, old trail markers, wells, graves." His voice was flat, but something darker moved beneath it. "Silas Vance has been buying paper faster than he has been buying land. You know the ledger is forged. I know it contains things that do not match the territory's own records. Can you prove it?" "Not yet." The answer landed between them. Jacob closed the book. "But I can prove he has been changing more than your boundary." Clara looked toward the dark line of Vance's ridge. "Then he'll come for the book. He already wants me gone. He wants everyone gone." Jacob studied her. "You should sleep with your rifle near the bed." "I already do." "I know." That made her look at him sharply. A faint expression passed over his face, not quite a smile. "I watched your house from the ridge before I rode in." "For how long?" "Long enough to know the west shutter still doesn't close." Clara almost laughed. Instead, her eyes burned. Jacob put the lark inside his coat. "I did not forget," he said. The words were quiet. They were enough. The army stayed another day, then another. Colonel Pearson said the land hearings would continue until the water disputes were settled. But Clara could see what the soldiers were really doing. They were waiting. Too many ranchers had brought conflicting claims. Too many boundary lines had shifted on maps that were supposedly official. Too many men used the word abandoned for places where smoke still rose from chimneys. By the third morning, the lower pasture looked like a temporary town. Canvas tents snapped in the wind. Saddles lay over rails. Coffee boiled black in kettles above small fires. Horses crowded Clara's troughs in shifts, while soldiers hauled water with the solemn urgency of men handling ammunition. The Apache scouts camped apart from the cavalry near the creek bed. Clara noticed the division without anyone explaining it. The officers called the scouts indispensable when they needed a trail read, a message carried, or a boundary found in country that could kill a stranger before breakfast. At supper, those same officers kept their blankets 50 yards away. Jacob moved between both camps. He translated orders in the morning, walked disputed fences in the afternoon, and rode at night. He did not come to the house. Clara told herself that was sensible. She hated it anyway. On the fourth evening, she baked 4 loaves of sourdough from the last good flour in the barrel. She wrapped them in linen, put them in a willow basket, and carried them toward the scouts' fires. The sunset had gone copper behind the mountains. The smell of mesquite smoke lay low along the ground. The scouts saw her long before she reached them. No one reached for a weapon, but every face turned. Clara stopped at the edge of the firelight. Jacob stood near a cottonwood, speaking quietly with an older man whose hair was braided with gray. He saw the basket, then he saw her. He did not wave her closer. He waited. The older scout rose and approached. His face was narrow and deeply lined, and one of his eyes was clouded white. He looked first at Clara's hands, then at the bread. She held out the basket. "For your camp." He touched one loaf with 2 fingers and said something Clara did not understand. Jacob answered him. The old man looked at Clara again, then he smiled. It was not a large smile, but it changed his face completely. "What did he say?" she asked. Jacob hesitated. "He knows who you are." "How?" The older man spoke again. Jacob looked toward the fire. "When I was young, I talked in my sleep." Clara waited. Jacob rubbed one thumb over the edge of his belt. "Apparently I talked about a girl who kept a wooden bird." Heat rose into Clara's face that had nothing to do with the fire. The old scout said one more sentence and walked away with the basket. "What was that?" Clara asked. Jacob's mouth moved at one corner. "He said the bread is late by 15 years. This time she did laugh. The sound surprised both of them. High above the camp on the north ridge, Silas Vance lowered a brass spyglass. Deputy Miller sat his horse beside him. Silas had watched Clara walk into the scout camp. He had watched the old man accept her bread. He had watched Jacob's face soften. He snapped the spyglass shut. "That's not neutrality," he said. Miller looked toward the distant fires. "She baked bread. She made an alliance. With supper?" Silas turned his head. Miller wished immediately he had kept quiet. Silas tucked the spyglass into his saddlebag. "The interpreter is a problem. He's army, he's paper. Army leaves, paper stays." Miller's mare shifted beneath him. Silas continued. "Men like him are dangerous, because everyone assumes they're simple until the page is already signed. He has records, old ones." "You know that?" "I know the way he looks at my ledger." Miller stared at the ridge line. "If the ledger is right, you have nothing to worry about." Silas smiled without humor. "Exactly." The next morning, Clara found Jacob at the north fence with pliers in his hand. Someone had cut 12 sections of wire during the night. Not cattle damage, not storm damage. Clean cuts. Jacob crouched beside one post, drawing 2 loose strands together. His sleeves were rolled above his elbows. The scars on his forearms were easier to see in daylight than they had been by the well. Clara carried a coil of spare wire over her shoulder. "You're supposed to be translating." "I am. This is fencing." He twisted the wire into a compact 3-loop knot. "This says someone crossed here after midnight with good cutters and bad intentions." Clara dropped the coil beside him. "I meant for the army. The army is arguing over maps. And you? I prefer evidence." She watched him finish the knot. Her breath caught. "You remember that?" He glanced at her. "My father's hitch. He taught us by the stock pond. You tied yours backward. I was 10. You tied it backward until you were 12. Clara stared at him. Jacob looked down again, but she saw it. A smile, small, brief, real. She crouched beside the next break. They worked down the line together. No declarations, no questions about the missing years. Just iron cedar posts and the soft click of pliers. At noon, Jacob found boot prints outside the fence. 2 riders had dismounted. One had a split heel on his left boot. The other favored his right leg. Their tracks led toward the ridge and disappeared on stone. "Vance's men?" Clara asked. "Probably. Can you prove it?" "No," she exhaled. Jacob looked toward the house. "Proof takes longer than suspicion. Silas knows that. That is why he likes paper." By sunset, the fence was whole again. Clara returned to the porch and found a dead jackrabbit on the top step. Its neck had been broken cleanly. A narrow strip of smoked deerskin tied the hind legs together. She looked toward the creek camp. No one was visible from the house. She carried the rabbit inside, skinned it at the back table, and simmered it with onion, salt, and the last 2 carrots from the garden. She did not send a plate to Jacob. The next morning, however, she found her wood box filled. She said nothing about that either. The quiet exchange continued for several days. A repaired hinge appeared on the smokehouse door. A clean strip of cloth was left beside Jacob's saddle after Clara noticed blood soaking through his glove. He set 2 jars of rendered bear fat on her porch for cracked leather. She left coffee near the lower pasture before dawn. Neither called these things kindness. On the frontier, kindness was often just another name for noticing what needed doing. The hearings dragged on. Silas became louder as the evidence became worse for him. He argued that the Whitlock ranch had failed production standards. Clara produced receipts showing grain sales during 2 of the years he claimed the place had been inactive. He said her father had surrendered the North Spring. Jacob found an army purchase record showing soldiers had paid Thomas Whitlock for water from that same spring 9 years after the supposed surrender date. Silas said the signatures were clerical errors. The colonel said nothing. Silas began drinking earlier each day. One afternoon, Jacob came to Clara while she was patching the stone lining of the old spring above the north pasture. The spring had nearly vanished under silt and roots after years of drought. Clara had spent weeks trying to clear it alone. Jacob took off his coat. "What are you doing?" "Seeing whether your water is dead or only buried. It's my spring, I know. You don't have to work it, I know." He picked up the iron bar anyway. They spent 5 hours moving stone. The work was ugly and slow. Clara wedged smaller rocks loose while Jacob levered a granite slab from the intake. Mud swallowed their boots. Gnats gathered around their faces. Once, a rattlesnake moved under a flat rock and Jacob froze with his hand out. He gave 2 short whistles and 1 long one. Clara dropped instantly. The snake slid past where her ankle had been. She looked up. Jacob was staring at her. "You remembered. My body did. So did mine." They returned to the spring. Near evening, a thin thread of water appeared between 2 roots. Clara stopped digging. Jacob cleared another handful of mud. The thread widened. Then cold water began flowing steadily into the channel. Clara sat back on her heels. She had forgotten what that sound did to a person after drought. It was not dramatic. Only water touching stone, but her throat closed. Jacob washed his hands in the flow. "You kept this place alive." "Barely. Alive is alive." They sat on the bank until the light went purple. Jacob took out his ledger. Clara groaned. "You write after everything? Anything worth remembering?" He opened to a page that was not a legal record. Stars were drawn across it, not decorative stars, positions, dates, arcs across seasons. Clara leaned closer. "What is that?" "Directions. There are no roads on it." "I didn't have roads." He turned another page. There were notes about springs, plants, soil, ridges, and places where water lasted through late summer. "I started with the stars," he said. "When I was moved north, I watched where they rose. When we went west, I marked where they fell behind the ridges. I thought if I kept enough of the sky straight, I could keep one direction straight. Home." He did not answer. She touched a faded line of writing in the margin. It said, "Cottonwood bends east in April wind." Another note read, "Whitlock windmill visible from South Ridge at noon." Clara looked at him. "You wrote this before you came back. Years before. How many? Most of them." The air between them changed. Jacob closed the book. "I was afraid memory would turn your ranch into something it never was." "What do you mean?" "A perfect place. Safe green. Waiting exactly as I left it." Clara looked over the cracked pasture. "You must be disappointed." "No." She turned. Jacob elbowed his forearms on his knees. "It's worse than I remembered." She stared. Then he added, "But it's real." She laughed again. This time he did too. The sound was rusty, as if he had not used it often. The storm arrived before they could return to the house. One moment the western sky was copper. The next it was purple-black. Wind slammed down the canyon hard enough to bend mesquite branches flat. Rain struck the dust in large cold drops and turned the path to mud within minutes. They ran for the old barn. Clara shoved against one door. Jacob came behind her and added his weight. Together they forced it closed. Inside, rain hammered the tin roof. The barn smelled of hay, damp cedar, manure, and old leather. Lightning flashed through cracks in the boards. Jacob did not sit near the center. He went automatically to the northeast corner, where the heaviest support beam met the stone footing, and crouched with his back to it. Clara noticed. He noticed her noticing. "You always choose the strongest wall?" she asked. "Always choose the wall most likely to still be there after trouble." "You say that like a carpenter." "I say it like someone who has slept in bad places." He lit a small brass lantern. The flame warmed a circle around them. For a while they listened to the storm. Then Jacob said, "I thought they would come back for me." Clara did not ask who. He stared at the lantern. The first year after we were taken, every horse sounded like your father's horse. Every wagon wheel sounded like his wagon. I thought he would ride into camp and say there had been a mistake. Clara swallowed. My father searched. Jacob's eyes lifted. He rode north 3 times. Once he was gone almost a month. He came back with fever and half a boot. Jacob looked away. He never told me. He didn't find you. No. The rain grew louder. Jacob rubbed his wrists. Clara saw the pale lines there. They tied us at first, he said, not the Apache, the men who moved us. Later there were other camps, other people, other rules. I ran, got caught, ran again. Eventually I stopped running where they could see it. His voice was almost without emotion. That made it worse. I learned languages because knowing what men planned kept me alive. I learned tracks because the mountains did not care what name I used. I learned how to be useful because useful people get one more day. Clara sat across from him on an overturned feed box. What about Taze? His jaw tightened. A name given by people who took me in when I had nothing left. It is mine too. So Jacob did survive, parts of him. Clara looked toward the barn door. The boy who made that bird? Jacob touched his coat where the lark rested. He was stubborn. He was terrible at carving feet. A breath of laughter left him, then faded. I held on to the promise because I needed one thing nobody else could rename. Clara's eyes burned. She kept her hands in her lap. You didn't owe me 15 years. I know. You don't owe me now. Then why are you here? He looked at her. Because I chose to be. The answer was simple. It settled deeper than any vow. Near dawn the storm passed. Cold mist lay over the valley. Clara and Jacob walked back toward the house through sucking mud. She heard the silence before she saw the corral. No cattle. The gate stood open. Clara stopped. Her herd was small. 37 head after 2 bad summers. But it was everything she could sell if the winter failed. Now the enclosure was churned mud and nothing else. She walked to the center. Jacob crouched by the gate. He pressed 2 fingers into a hoofprint. They were driven. In that storm, because of the storm. He moved along the edge of the corral, reading the ground as if it had been written for him. Then he found a deeper track, a horseshoe mark with a notch cut into one side. Jacob's expression changed. Clara knew that shoe. Silas's bay wore a traction notch on the front left hoof. She had seen the blacksmith make it after the horse slipped on the north ridge the previous spring. He came himself, she said, or someone rode his horse. You think he would lend that animal? No. Jacob stood. Clara went toward the house. Where are you going? To get my rifle? No. She turned sharply. Those cattle are my winter. And if he wants you angry, riding blind into his men is exactly what he planned. What do you suggest? Ask politely. I suggest we find the herd before we find the thief. She held his gaze, then went inside for her coat instead. They rode north. The flash flood had erased most ordinary tracks, but Jacob did not follow ordinary tracks. He looked for broken creosote tips, mud splashed on the wrong side of rocks, dung too fresh to belong to range cattle. A thread of red hair caught on a mesquite thorn. Clara stayed close and said little. 2 hours later, they heard lowing below a limestone shelf. The herd had been pushed into a narrow wash and held there by 3 men. One was trying to alter a brand with a hot iron. Jacob dismounted behind the ridge. How many? Clara whispered. 3. I see 3. I hear 4 horses. She looked again. A 4th horse was tied behind the brush. Plan? Jacob handed her the reins. You ride down the east slope where they can see you. That sounds like a poor plan. They'll watch you. And you? They won't. Before she could argue, he was gone. Clara waited 10 breaths, mounted, and rode down the slope with her rifle across the saddle. The first man spotted her. Well, look who came looking. Clara kept moving. Those are Whitlock cattle. The man laughed. Not according to the bill of sale. Show it. He rested a hand near his revolver. Ride home. A voice came from behind him. Take your hand away from the gun. Jacob stood 10 yards uphill with a rifle, leveled. The second man spun. Another scout appeared from the brush on his left. Then another. The 3 cattle thieves froze. Jacob's voice remained calm. Brands are recorded. Ear cuts are recorded. Your tracks are recorded. If you want to add armed theft to the list, touch the gun. No one touched it. By noon, Clara's herd was moving home. Silas was already waiting at the army camp. He had a new story prepared. The cattle, he claimed, were his. The scouts had stolen them from his drovers. The colonel listened with the patience of a man whose headache had become a person. Jacob presented the brands, earmarks, and herd count. Silas presented a bill of sale signed by a magistrate. The dates did not match. Silas blamed clerks. The colonel postponed judgment again. That afternoon, Deputy Miller rode to Clara's ranch carrying a warrant. Clara met him on the porch. Jacob stood behind her. Miller unfolded the paper. I have an order for the arrest of the scout known as Taze, charged with cattle rustling and interference with lawful property recovery. Clara held out her hand. Let me see. Miller hesitated. Elias. He gave her the paper. She read it twice, then handed it back. There's no one here by that name. Miller stared at her. Don't do this. The warrant says Taze. He pointed past her. That man. That man is Jacob Blackwood. Miller's face changed. Clara stepped down one stair. Citizen born in this territory, son of Amos and Rebecca Blackwood. Their homestead was north of mine. Miller looked at Jacob. Jacob said nothing. If you want Jacob Blackwood, Clara continued, bring a warrant for Jacob Blackwood. And when you do, explain to Colonel Pearson why a county deputy is arresting his appointed interpreter under a name the Army itself does not use on civilian records. Miller looked at the page. He knew enough law to understand the trouble. Clara's voice softened. You can still choose which man wears that badge, Elias. Miller folded the warrant. His shoulders sagged. He put it away. This won't stop Vance. No, Clara said, but maybe one day you will. He mounted and left. Jacob watched until the deputy disappeared over the ridge. Then he looked at Clara. You lied. She folded her arms. Did I? His eyes warmed. No, he said. I suppose you didn't. That night Jacob brought the translation ledger into Clara's kitchen. It was the first time he crossed the threshold since returning. He stopped just inside the door. Clara noticed the way his eyes moved automatically. Stove, windows, back door, rifle peg, narrow hall, ceiling beam. A man measuring exits. She pretended not to notice. Sit, she said. He sat at the corner of the table with his back to the wall. Clara poured chicory coffee into 2 cups and set one beside him. Then she lit the second lamp because his writing had grown too small for the first. He opened the ledger. Clara put Silas's cattle bill, the eviction notice, and every old Whitlock receipt she had found beside it. For 3 hours they compared numbers. The work was tedious enough to make anger useful. A herd count dated 2 years earlier listed 52 Whitlock steers sold to an Army quartermaster. Silas's ledger said the ranch had produced no cattle that year. A water payment carried Thomas Whitlock's signature 6 years after Vance claimed the North Spring had been transferred. A tax receipt from Tucson used a parcel number different from the one on Clara's eviction notice. Jacob copied each discrepancy. Clara watched him write. His hand was steady, elegant, and much more patient than the boy's hand that had carved a lopsided bird. You write like a schoolmaster, she said. I learned from men who would reject a truth if the letters leaned the wrong way. That sounds like them. He turned a page. Clara saw a map tucked into the back of the book. Wait. Jacob's hand stopped. She pulled the sheet partly free. The San Pedro Valley had been drawn in charcoal and ink. The line of the river was exact. Springs were marked with small circles. Old fence lines appeared where no fences stood now. One boundary ran across the northern hills and enclosed land Silas claimed as his family's original estate. At the center of it was a name Clara had not seen in years. Blackwood. She looked at Jacob. You've been mapping your family's place. Not only mine. He unfolded the rest. Several old homesteads appeared beneath later boundaries. Some belonged to settlers. Some were marked with Apache names. Some had notes beside them. Burned, abandoned after troop order, owner relocated, deed amended. You think the whole valley was redrawn. I think powerful men found it easier to move lines after the people who knew the lines were dead or gone. Clara touched one mark near the North Spring. This is Vance's house. Now, what was there before? Jacob's eyes stayed on the map. My father's storage cellar. Maybe part of the original cabin foundation. Clara sat back. Silas's large 2-story house had always looked unnatural on the ridge, too formal for the country around it. She remembered, as a child, seeing smoke there before the Vance place was built. She remembered adults refusing to discuss it. Sarah might know, she said. Jacob looked up. Why Sarah? Her father hauled stone for half the valley. He helped build Vance's place. They left after midnight. The horses picked their way through cold moonlight toward Sarah Finch's small house. Mesquite branches brushed Clara's sleeves. The night smelled of sage and damp earth left from the storm. Sarah was awake. She sat on her porch smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. When she saw Jacob, she did not act surprised. That took you long enough, she said. Clara dismounted. You knew we were coming? I knew somebody eventually would ask why Silas Vance's house has a cellar twice the size it needs. Jacob's gaze sharpened. Sarah crushed the cigarette under her boot. Come inside. Her kitchen was smaller than Clara's and warmer. Bundles of dried sage hung from the rafters. A crock of vinegar sat by the stove. Sarah moved the rug near the hearth and pried up a floorboard with a butter knife. From beneath it, she removed a long object wrapped in oilcloth. She put it on the table and unrolled it. A rusted iron key lay inside. Its bow was shaped like a rough heart. Jacob did not move. Sarah looked at him. "My father kept this." "From what?" Jacob asked. "Your father's house." Clara felt a chill run over her arms. Sarah sat down. "The winter your family disappeared, my father was hauling stone for Harlan Vance. Silas's father." Jacob remained standing. Sarah continued carefully. "Harlan wanted the North Ridge. Said your father's claim interfered with a freight route he planned to sell rights to." Amos wouldn't sign. Clara knew enough of the story to feel sick before Sarah reached the rest. "One night there was a fire," Sarah said. "Officially, the Blackwoods fled after an Apache attack. That's what people repeated. But my father saw Harlan's men on the ridge before the flames. He saw Deputy Miller's father there too." Jacob's face seemed carved from stone. Why did he stay silent? Sarah's eyes filled, though her voice did not change. Because he had 3 children. Because Harlan had money. Because cowardice always has a reason when it tells its own story. She pushed the key toward him. "Your father's front door had this lock. Harlan reused the stone foundation when he built the new house. My father found the key in the ashes and hid it." Jacob looked at the rusted iron. He did not touch it. Clara said, "Jacob." His hand finally closed around the key. Sarah let out a slow breath. "There may be something else." "My father said Amos kept land papers in a tin box under the cellar floor. He never knew whether Harlan found them." Jacob's fingers tightened around the key. Clara felt the story of her own ranch changing shape around her. Silas was not merely trying to steal one struggling woman's land. He was finishing work begun by his father. They rode back before dawn. In Clara's kitchen, Jacob placed the key beside the ledger. He did not speak for a long time. Clara heated salt pork in a skillet and cracked 2 eggs into the grease. The ordinary sounds filled the room. Fat snapping, iron scraping, the stove ticking as it warmed. She set a plate in front of him. He tapped the salt tin 3 times before shaking it over the eggs. Clara stopped. Jacob looked up. "You still do that?" "Do what?" 3 taps. He looked at the tin in his hand. "My mother did it. So did you." He set the salt down carefully. For several minutes they ate. Clara put honey near his elbow. He stared at it. "What?" she asked. "My mother used to hide honey when winter was bad. Mine hid coffee." "Your mother couldn't hide anything. Your father found everything. He never found her good tobacco." Jacob's head came up. Clara smiled. "See? You missed things." He looked down at his plate. The smile he gave was faint but stayed longer this time. After eating, he did not leave. He rested both hands on the scarred tabletop and stared at the room. The lamp flame moved in a draft near the window. Finally he said, "I kept the promise." Clara's chest tightened. "I came back to the porch. Yes. I don't know if I can live inside the house." She understood immediately that he did not mean the building. Jacob rubbed the heel of his hand across his chest as though something there hurt. "In the mountains, I could sleep where I saw the sky. In army camps, I knew the rules. Here." He looked toward the hallway. "Here I hear boards settle and think someone is outside. A door closes and I count windows. A full plate makes me wonder when the next empty one comes." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "You don't have to become who you were. I don't know who that was. You were rude." He looked at her. "You stole my biscuits. You stole my knife. You gave me the knife. You asked while holding it." That almost became another laugh. Clara's expression softened. "You don't owe this house a performance, Jacob." He looked at her. "You don't have to sleep in a bed because other people think it proves you're civilized. You don't have to use the name Jacob every hour. You don't have to throw Taze away to come home." Something in his face loosened. "I thought you would want the boy back. The boy would be useless with that north fence." This time he laughed fully. It ended quickly, but the room felt different afterward. Before he left, Jacob took the wooden lark from his coat. He turned it over in the lamplight. "When I carved this, I thought birds belonged to the sky because nobody could fence the sky." Clara touched the chipped wing. "That's what the oversized head was for?" "No. That was poor planning." She smiled. Jacob placed the lark in her hand. "I told myself if I found this porch again, I'd know there was one place in the world that hadn't been taken by somebody's paper." Clara closed her fingers around the bird. "Silas is trying. He's going to fail. You sound certain. I have stopped mistaking rich men for gods." He opened the door. Cold air entered the kitchen. Clara said Jacob. He looked back. If you need the sky, sleep on the porch. He considered that, then nodded. By morning, a bedroll lay against the east wall of the porch. Clara stepped over it on her way to feed the chickens. She did not mention it. Silas Vance spent that same morning in Colonel Pearson's command tent, trying to turn stolen cattle into evidence. He brought a second ledger, cleaner than the first, and a bottle of bourbon. The colonel accepted neither. You claim the Whitlock cattle are yours, Pearson said. They were purchased through an intermediary. Who? A drover out of Benson. Name? Silas paused too long. Rourke first name? Silas's jaw tightened. I can retrieve the bill. I thought you brought the bill. The colonel pushed the paper back across the folding table. Silas looked toward Jacob, who stood near the tent entrance. This man has influenced your judgment. Pearson's eyes narrowed. He has translated records. He has childhood ties to the claimant, which he disclosed. Silas looked at Jacob. Jacob said nothing. People like him understand loyalty differently, Silas said. The colonel's face went flat. What people? Silas recognized the trap and stepped around it. Men who've lived outside the law. Jacob opened the translation ledger. Would you like that entered into the record? Silas stared at him. The colonel almost smiled. Silas picked up his hat and left. By evening his patience was gone. 3 riders came to his private camp after dark. They were men who worked where legal documents stopped working. One had a scar across his nose. Another wore a cavalry belt without insignia. The third smelled strongly of kerosene even before Silas set the can on the table between them. The barn first, Silas said. The scarred man looked at him. You said the house. I changed my mind. Why? Fire moves. If it reaches the house, that is weather. The younger man laughed. Silas did not. No bodies if you can avoid it. I don't want a murder inquiry. What about the interpreter? Silas poured whiskey. He sleeps outside. That a problem? Silas looked toward the dark ledge where Clara's windmill stood against the stars. It becomes one if he wakes up. He slid a pouch of coins across the table. The riders left without another word. At the ranch, the night was too still. Jacob noticed it first. He lay awake on the porch, staring through the railing at the north field. The usual insects had gone quiet near the barn. A horse snorted in the lower pasture. Then he smelled kerosene. He was on his feet before the first flame climbed the barn wall. Clara! The fire ran fast through dry hay. Orange light filled the yard. Clara came out barefoot with her rifle in one hand and a wool blanket in the other. Men on the north side, Jacob shouted. She saw 3 shadows break toward the ridge. Her rifle came up. Jacob knocked the barrel down. The barn. They'll get away. Let them. My father built that barn. Then save what he built. The words hit. Clara dropped the rifle. The well could not feed enough water to drown a fire that size. Jacob knew it immediately. He dragged 2 blankets through the horse trough and threw one to Clara. Beat the grass downwind, not the boards. She understood. If they could not save the barn, they could stop the fire from taking the house and pasture. Jacob used a shovel to cut a trench through dry weeds. Clara followed, hacking at roots and throwing loose dirt over sparks. The heat was monstrous. Hair singed along Clara's temple. Smoke filled her mouth. The barn roof collapsed with a roar that sent burning shingles into the yard. Jacob shouted something in Apache to the scouts running up from the creek camp, then repeated it in English for the soldiers behind them. Clear to bare earth, 20 feet. Move. Men spread along the fire break. For the next hour, there was no army camp, no scout camp, no rancher, no interpreter, only people fighting flame. Clara swung the wet blanket until her shoulders went numb. Jacob dug until blood ran from a reopened cut in his palm. The wind shifted once and nearly carried fire toward the house. They shifted with it. By dawn, the barn was a black skeleton. The house still stood. The windmill still turned. The pasture had burned in patches, but the main grassland was safe. Clara stood in ash up to her ankles. She looked at the smoking beams and said nothing. Jacob approached with soot blackening his face. You hurt? No. He looked at her bare feet. You're bleeding. She looked down as if surprised to find blood there. A nail had opened the side of her heel. It can wait. Jacob crouched beside the barn foundation. Something dark lay near a fallen wall, a leather satchel. The outer surface had blistered, but the flap remained closed. He picked it up carefully. Clara recognized the brass clasp. She had seen Silas carry it. Jacob opened the bag. Inside were several folded papers. Most had burned at the edges. One was a torn page from Silas's property ledger. Clara stared. Why would his men bring that? Maybe instructions. Maybe they took papers from his camp by mistake. Jacob held the page toward the morning light. The heat had changed the ink. A fresh dark layer had bubbled and cracked away from the paper. Beneath it, older writing showed through. Clara stepped closer. The visible lines did not match the ones she had read in Silas's ledger. A boundary that had been drawn north now ran west. A date had appeared beneath another date, and under a smeared ownership entry was an older name, Amos Blackwood. Jacob stopped breathing for a moment. Clara looked at him. The rusted key in his pocket suddenly seemed to weigh more than iron should. He turned the page carefully. Another line named Thomas Whitlock as an adjoining claimant and water right witness. The fire had burned away enough of the forgery to expose the history beneath it. Clara's grief over the barn did not disappear, but it changed shape. Silas had tried to erase the past with flame. Instead, he had heated his own lie until it peeled open. Jacob folded the scorched page inside a clean cloth. "We take this to Pearson now." Clara looked at the ruined barn. Now, he met her eyes before Silas knows what survived. She nodded. Then she bent, picked up her father's old hammer from the ash, and carried it with her to the army table. Colonel Pearson had not yet shaved. He sat beneath the command awning in shirt sleeves, drinking coffee that looked strong enough to stain tin. Two officers stood nearby arguing over a map until Jacob put the scorched page on the table. The argument stopped. Pearson looked first at Jacob's face, then at Clara's bare, bandaged foot, then toward the smoke rising from the Whitlock barn. "What happened?" "Arson," Jacob said. Witnesses, 3 riders were seen leaving the property. One dropped a satchel. Jacob opened it. Pearson's eyes settled on the page. Silas arrived less than 20 minutes later. He came fast, coat half-buttoned, his bay foaming at the mouth. Deputy Miller followed at a distance. Silas dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. "I heard there was a fire." Clara looked at the satchel. "So did your paperwork." Silas saw it. His face did not change immediately, but the hand holding his reins tightened. Pearson spoke. "Mr. Vance, come here." Silas approached the table. Jacob placed 3 records side by side. First, the scorched page. Second, his own translation ledger. Third, an army quartermaster log from 12 years earlier. He did not accuse Silas. He began with dates. "Your claim states the Whitlock North parcel was abandoned in the spring of 1879. Silas nodded. "Correct." Jacob pointed to the quartermaster record. "The army purchased grain from Thomas Whitlock in the autumn of 1880. A clerical error. Then another." Jacob turned a page. "Water purchased from the same parcel in 1881. Silas's mouth tightened. The Army survey men routinely confused local boundaries. Jacob looked at Pearson. The colonel said, "Continue." Jacob pointed to the scorched sheet. Heat separated the newer ink from the older iron gall ink beneath it. The earlier entry places the Whitlock boundary east of the spring and the Blackwood boundary north of it. The altered entry moves both. Silas leaned over the table. "You expect a burned scrap to outweigh a sealed territorial book?" "No," Jacob said. "I expect the burned scrap to be compared with records you did not control." He opened his ledger to a copied survey note. This description was made by Lieutenant Harrow during a patrol 15 years ago. He recorded the Blackwood spring marker at the same location shown beneath the altered ink. Silas looked at Pearson. "You're taking the word of a scout over a lawful claimant." Pearson's expression hardened. "I'm looking at my own army's record," Jacob continued. He produced Clara's tax receipts. He produced cattle sales. He produced a page from his ledger recording the brand and ear cuts on the recovered herd. Then he produced Sarah Finch's written statement, taken before dawn with 2 soldiers as witnesses. The statement described the Blackwood fire, the old foundation beneath the Vance house, and the key Sarah's father had hidden for years. Silas read the first paragraph and threw the page down. "That woman is a gossip. She's a witness," Jacob said, "to something she did not personally see. Her father did. Her father is dead." Jacob's eyes went cold, so is mine. The words changed the air. Silas looked at him fully now, not at the interpreter, at Jacob Blackwood. "You think that name gives you a claim?" "No." Jacob's voice stayed low. "The records do." Silas laughed once, but it sounded thin. "This is sentiment dressed up as law." Clara set her father's hammer on the table. Silas glanced at it. "You burned my barn," she said. "You have no proof. The men dropped your satchel, stolen, with your ledger page, also stolen. Convenient." Silas turned to Pearson. "You see what this is? She loses a building and suddenly every accident becomes my conspiracy." Pearson picked up the scorched page. "Why is this page missing from your ledger?" Silas froze. The colonel looked toward one of his officers. "Bring the book." A soldier carried Silas's property ledger from the records table. Pearson opened it to the section Jacob indicated. One page had been cut out close to the binding. The scorched fragment matched the remaining edge. Silas's face drained. Deputy Miller stood 10 paces away. Pearson looked at him. Deputy, did Mr. Vance report a stolen satchel? Miller swallowed. No, sir. Did he report a stolen ledger page? No, sir. Silas turned. Elias. Miller would not meet his eyes. Pearson continued. Did you issue an eviction notice against Clara Whitlock? Yes, sir. On whose petition? Miller hesitated. Silas Vance's. Did you verify the original deed? No. Why not? Silas stepped in. This is irrelevant. Pearson slammed his palm on the table. No, Mr. Vance. For the first time this week, it is becoming extremely relevant. The nearby camp fell silent. Miller stared at his boots. Pearson's voice lowered. Deputy? Miller looked at Clara. She did not plead. She did not nod. She simply waited. Miller removed his hat. Because Vance told me the Tucson seal was enough. Did he pay you? Silas snapped. Think carefully. Miller's face reddened. Pearson repeated. Did he pay you? Miller closed his eyes for a second. Yes. Clara felt no triumph, only a deep exhaustion that reached into her bones. Silas moved first. He shoved the table hard enough to spill Pearson's coffee and lunged toward his horse. Two soldiers grabbed for him, but he slipped between them. He reached the bay. Then Deputy Miller stepped into his path. Silas stopped. Move. Miller's hand shook, but he stayed where he was. Elias, don't. You know what I've done for you. Miller looked at the badge on his own chest. Then at Clara's burned barn, I know. Silas's voice turned soft. You owe me. Miller took out his handcuffs. No, he said. That's the trouble. Silas's face changed. He swung. Miller took the blow on the cheek and caught Silas's arm. They stumbled into the dust. A soldier stepped forward, but Pearson raised a hand and let the deputy finish. Miller forced Silas to his knees. The cuffs closed around his wrists. The click was small. Clara heard it clearly. Silas looked up from the ground, dust streaking one side of his face. This isn't over. Clara stared at him. Yes, she said. It is. Pearson ordered the ledgers seized. By noon, two soldiers had ridden toward Tucson with copies of the evidence and instructions to place a hold on every Vance land transfer in the county. Silas remained under guard. Miller sat alone outside the command tent holding a wet cloth to his cheek. Clara passed him on the way home. He said her name. She stopped. I'm sorry. Clara looked at him. He seemed older than he had the day before. For which part? She asked. Miller lowered the cloth. All of it. She considered that. Sorry is what you say before you fix what you can. He nodded. What can I fix? Start with the records you signed. She walked on. Jacob caught up near the well. You could have forgiven him. I could have. You didn't. Not yet. Jacob nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. They stood by the smoking remains of the barn. Clara's cattle grazed in the lower pasture, thin but alive. The windmill turned unevenly overhead. Ash drifted from the ruin and settled on Jacob's sleeve. So what happens? Clara asked. The colonel suspends the eviction. Tucson reviews the claims. How long? Could be weeks? Months? Could be. Clara sighed. Jacob looked at her. But Silas cannot take possession while the records are under fraud review. That is the first cheerful thing you've said. It wasn't cheerful. It was close. They began cleaning before the ash cooled. Clara found nails that could be straightened. Jacob separated burned boards from beams that still had sound heartwood. Soldiers helped lift the collapsed roof enough to pull out tools trapped beneath it. By afternoon, the ruin looked less like a grave and more like work waiting to be done. 3 days later, riders came from Tucson. The territorial clerk among them was a narrow man with spectacles and an expression of permanent indigestion. He carried copied deeds, tax rolls, and 2 sealed boxes of county records. He spent 6 hours with Colonel Pearson and Jacob. At sunset, he asked Clara to come to the table. She wiped her hands on her skirt and sat. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. Miss Whitlock, your father's original deed appears to have been misfiled under a parcel designations discontinued 13 years ago. Clara stared at him. Misfiled. Yes, for 13 years, so it appears. Jacob looked down at his hands. Clara knew he was hiding a smile. The clerk continued. The deed is valid. Your tax history supports continuous possession. The Vance transfer is void pending criminal investigation. Clara exhaled slowly. What about the North Ridge? The clerk looked at Jacob. That is more complicated. Jacob's face closed. The man unfolded an older survey. The Blackwood homestead claim appears genuine and predates the Vance estate. However, because the family was removed, the legal chain afterward is irregular. Irregular, Clara repeated. The clerk had the grace to look uncomfortable. "There will need to be a hearing," Jacob said. "There always is." The clerk gathered his papers. "But for present purposes, Vance cannot claim it." That night, Clara cooked the first proper meal she had made in weeks: beans with pork, corn cakes, fried apples from the last jar in the pantry. Jacob ate at the table rather than the porch. He still sat with his back to the wall. Clara did not mention that either. After supper, they went outside. The valley was cool enough to see their breath. Jacob held the rusted key Sarah had given him. "I thought I would want his house," he said. "Silas's, my father's ground under it." Clara waited. "I thought I would want to walk in and make him watch me open the door with this." "Do you?" Jacob turned the key in his hand. "No. Why? Because that house is his. Even if the stones underneath belong to my father, the rooms are full of Vance." He looked toward Clara's damaged barn. "I would rather build something that doesn't smell like revenge." She leaned against the porch post. "That sounds expensive." He gave her a sideways look. "You're practical at terrible moments. Somebody has to be." The next morning, Colonel Pearson asked Jacob to walk with him. They went beyond the lower pasture where the ground rose toward the creek. Pearson carried a leather case. "You did good work here," he said. Jacob nodded. "That is not false modesty, is it?" "No." Pearson almost smiled. He opened the case. Inside was a formal commission bearing the seal of the United States Army. "Chief interpreter," Pearson said. "Permanent salary. Travel allowance. Authority to train junior translators and review treaty communications before signature." Jacob looked at the paper. Pearson continued. "You are wasted taking temporary contracts. Maybe. You could prevent what happened here in other valleys." Jacob looked toward the ranch house. That argument hurt because it was true. Pearson saw it. "I won't pretend the Army has used men like you kindly," he said. "But the work matters." Jacob traced the edge of the leather case. "I know. You don't have to answer this minute." "I do." Pearson waited. Jacob closed the case and handed it back. "No." The colonel studied him. "Because of her?" Jacob's eyes sharpened. "Because of me." Pearson accepted the correction. Jacob continued. "I learned your laws because I needed to survive them. I used your ledger because the people in power only listened to paper. That does not mean I want to spend the rest of my life following cavalry columns. You would have influence. I would have orders." Pearson looked toward the creek. "That ranch may not keep you. No place keeps a man. What does?" Jacob considered the question. "A choice he makes again tomorrow." Pearson nodded once. "I'll leave the offer open until we ride." "You can." When Jacob returned to the porch, Clara was repairing a harness strap with an awl. She did not look up. "He offered you something." Jacob stopped. "How do you know?" "He took the leather case." "You watch too much." "I own a ranch." "Watching prevents funerals." Jacob sat on the step. "Permanent commission." Her hands stopped. "That's good work." "Yes." "Good pay?" "Yes." "Better than cattle?" "Almost everything is better than cattle." She went back to stitching. "You should take it if you want it." I said no. The awl stopped again. Clara looked up. "Why?" Jacob's expression closed slightly. She saw the old instinct in him, the expectation that his choice would become a debt. So she set the harness aside. "Let me say this right." He waited. "I don't need you to stay because of a promise you made when you were 10. Jacob's jaw tightened. "I know. I don't need you to stay because my barn burned." He said nothing. "I don't need a protector." "That one I know. I'm offering you something else." Clara went inside and returned with a blank legal form the Tucson clerk had left behind. She placed it on the porch rail. "What is that?" "A partnership deed." Jacob stared at her. "The North Ridge claim may be yours. The Whitlock parcel is mine. The spring feeds both. So if you want to stay, we stop pretending one family's line matters more than the work keeping the place alive." He looked at the empty signature line. "Half? Half of the labor, half of the risk. Half of whatever the drought leaves us. And the house? You can sleep on the roof for all I care." His mouth twitched. Clara continued. "I'm not offering gratitude. I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering dirt, cattle, taxes, broken hinges, and a windmill that screams when the weather changes." Jacob looked at her. "That is a terrible proposal. It's the only one I have." He reached for the paper. His fingers rested on it. Then hoofbeats sounded from the ridge. Both turned. 4 riders were coming toward the ranch. Clara recognized one of them. The man with the scar across his nose, one of Silas's hired men. Jacob stood. Clara reached for the rifle by the door. He stopped her with a hand. "What? Not yet." The riders approached slowly. No army soldiers followed them. No deputy. The scarred man pulled up outside the gate. "Vance is in chains," he called. "That doesn't erase what he owes." Jacob walked down the steps carrying only the translation ledger. Clara's hand remained on the rifle. The scarred man laughed. "You going to read us to death?" Jacob opened the book. "Yes," he said. The scarred rider smiled because he thought Jacob was joking. Jacob turned a page. "Caleb Rourke." The smile disappeared. The rider's horse shifted under him. Jacob continued. "Deserted from a territorial freight escort near Gila Bend, April 1882. Questioned in connection with 6 missing government rifles. Seen the following autumn near a burned homestead outside Safford." Rourke's hand moved toward his coat. Clara raised the rifle. Jacob did not look back at her. "Keep your hand where I can see it." Rourke froze. One of the younger riders glanced at him. Jacob turned another page. "Peter Sloan. Arrest warrant in Texas for horse theft. Escaped custody near El Paso, alias Peter Shaw, alias William Sloan." The young rider went pale. Jacob looked at the third man, Matthew Clegg, Army wagon contractor. Dismissed after medicine shipments went missing from Fort Grant. 2 witnesses identified you selling the same crates in Tucson. Clegg cursed softly. The 4th rider had already begun turning his horse. Rourke spat into the dust. "You think a book protects you?" "No." Jacob closed the ledger halfway. "The copies do." Rourke stopped. Jacob's voice remained even. "1 copy is with Colonel Pearson. Another left for Tucson 3 days ago. If anything happens on this ranch, your names go with the arson testimony. You don't have testimony. The satchel puts Vance's property at the fire. Scouts saw 3 riders leaving the north side. Your left boot has a split heel." Rourke looked down before he could stop himself. Clara saw it. So did the other men. Jacob opened the book again. "And you are missing the brass button from your right cuff." Rourke's eyes narrowed. Jacob reached into his pocket and held up a small dark object. "A brass button blackened by smoke. I found it beside the kerosene trail." The yard became very quiet. Rourke's face hardened. "You could have planted that." "I could have." Jacob tucked it away. "That is why I did not bring it to you. I brought it to the colonel." The 4th rider turned fully. "We're leaving." Rourke snapped. "Stay put." "No." The young man Jacob had called Sloan looked toward the road. Rourke realized his hired courage was thinning. He looked at Clara. "This your man now?" Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. "No," she said. "He's his own." Jacob glanced at her. Rourke did not understand why that answer unsettled him, but it did. He pulled his reins hard. "This valley isn't done with you." Clara answered before Jacob could. "The valley never started with you." Rourke wheeled his horse. The others followed. Their hoofbeats faded toward the ridge. Clara kept the rifle raised until Jacob said, "They're gone. I know. You can lower it. I know." She lowered it anyway. Jacob looked at her. "You called me my own." "You are," he nodded slowly. Then looked toward the partnership deed still lying on the porch rail. "Is that still there?" "Unless the wind took it." They walked back together. The paper had not moved. Jacob sat at the table inside, sharpened a pencil with his knife, and read every line. Clara waded through all of it. He looked at her once. "You know this gives me rights to the water?" "Yes, and half the cattle increase. If the cows cooperate, and half the debts, those cooperate very well." Jacob bent over the paper. He signed 2 names, Jacob Blackwood. Then beneath it, in smaller letters, Taze. Clara looked at both. He straightened. "If the law wants one man, it can have both." She signed beside him. There was no ceremony, no witness except the lantern and the cracked kitchen window. Clara put the deed under a heavy coffee tin until morning. The next week belonged to work. The army prepared to leave. Colonel Pearson sent 2 carpenters to help stabilize what remained of the barn, though Clara suspected Jacob had asked without saying so. Deputy Miller came twice carrying corrected copies of county notices. The second time he brought $3 silver in an envelope. Clara looked at them. "What is this? Money Vance paid me." "All of it?" "No, then bring all of it." Miller nodded. On his 3rd visit he did. Clara did not keep the money. She gave half to Sarah Finch for the mercantile account and used the rest to buy nails, hinges, lamp oil, and 2 sacks of flour for the scout camp before it departed. Miller watched her write the purchases in a small notebook. "You always keep records?" he asked. More carefully now. His eyes dropped. "Fair." The day the cavalry left, Colonel Pearson shook Jacob's hand. "You change your mind, send word. I won't." Pearson smiled. "That is the first time I've believed you immediately." The scouts rode out last. The older man with the clouded eye stopped near the porch. He said something to Jacob, then to Clara. "What did he say?" she asked. Jacob watched the old scout ride away. "He said I finally learned which direction I was traveling. And to me?" Jacob hesitated. Clara narrowed her eyes. "Tell me." He said your bread improved. She stared at him. Jacob walked toward the barn before she could decide whether he was lying. Without the army camp, the ranch felt large again. Not empty. Large, the difference mattered. They began rebuilding with what the fire had left. Jacob sorted the beams by soundness. He struck each piece of cedar with the back of an axe and listened to the note. Hollow wood went to the burn pile. Solid wood was scraped clean with a draw knife. Clara watched black char peel away in curled strips, exposing dark gold heartwood beneath. That one looks ruined, she said. Jacob ran a hand along the beam. Surface is burned, core is good. Can it carry weight? He lifted one end. Yes, you sure? He looked at her. Ask me after we put a roof on it, she snorted. They set the first upright before noon. It took both of them. A block and tackle, 2 ropes, and a stream of language Clara would not have used in church. When the beam dropped into the stone footing, Jacob hammered the brace pin through. The sound rang across the yard. Clara stood back. One blackened post held against the bright sky. It looked scarred. It also looked strong. They kept working. Days became a rhythm. Feed at sunrise. Fence checks before the heat. Barn work until noon. Ledger work after supper. Jacob built a low sleeping platform under the east porch roof and used it more often than the spare room. On cold nights, he came inside. Clara never asked which place counted as progress. Sometimes he woke before dawn and walked the boundary alone. Sometimes she found him, sitting by the spring with the translation ledger closed on his knee. She learned not every silence needed to be opened. He learned not every closed door was a trap. One evening she found him repairing the kitchen latch. It worked, she said. It rattled. It has rattled since I was 16, I know. That is not a reason to fix it. It woke me. That is a reason. He replaced the worn pin. The latch never rattled again. Clara missed the sound for 3 nights. On another evening, Jacob stood shirtless by the pump washing soot from his arms after scraping beams. Clara came out carrying clean towels. She stopped when she saw the scars across his back and chest. Some were thin white lines. Others were rough, raised knots. One ran from below his ribs toward his shoulder. Jacob noticed her stillness. He reached for his shirt. You don't have to hide them, she said. I'm not hiding. You move quickly for a man not hiding. He lowered the shirt. Clara set the towels on the pump handle. What happened? He looked toward the pasture. Which one? The one on your side. Knife, the long one? Horse dragged me. The one near your shoulder? Bullet. Clara's hand curled around the edge of the towel. Jacob saw. Most of them are old. That doesn't make them polite. He almost smiled. She stepped closer but did not touch him. I used to imagine you dead, she said. Jacob's face changed. I decided it was easier than imagining what might be happening. He looked down. I used to imagine the ranch gone. Why? Same reason. Clara finally lifted one hand. She stopped before touching the scar near his ribs. Jacob nodded once. Her fingertips rested lightly against the raised skin. He flinched. Not away from pain, from the gentleness of it. Clara withdrew her hand. Sorry. No. He caught her wrist. His grip was careful. Don't be. They stood beside the pump while water dripped into the dirt. Then a calf bawled from the lower pasture. Clara pulled free. That one's been trying to climb through the fence all day. Jacob picked up his shirt. Your cattle are stupid. Our cattle. He looked at her. That was cruel. You signed. They went after the calf together. A week later, the Tucson clerk returned with formal orders. Silas Vance had been charged with fraud, bribery, conspiracy to commit arson, and theft of livestock. Harlan Vance's old transfers were being reviewed. Several families who had lost parcels over the previous 20 years had filed claims. Deputy Miller had surrendered his badge temporarily while the court examined his conduct. He came to tell Clara himself. What will you do? She asked. Work for Finch until the hearing. Sarah hired you? She said someone has to move feed sacks. Clara smiled despite herself. Miller looked toward Jacob, who was fitting boards to the barn roof. I owe him an apology, too. Then give him one. Miller hesitated. He doesn't much like me. That has never stopped you from talking before. Miller climbed the ladder. Clara could not hear the whole conversation. She saw Miller speak. Jacob listened without moving. Miller took off his hat. Jacob said something short. Miller nodded. When he came down, Clara asked, Well? He said apologies are cheap. That sounds like him. He said labor is expensive. That also sounds like him. Miller looked up at the roof. He told me to bring shingles tomorrow. Clara laughed. Miller did bring shingles, so did Sarah's husband. Then 2 ranchers who had stood beneath the mercantile awning, while Silas stirred the town against Jacob, arrived with a wagon of cedar planks. Neither gave a speech. One simply said, "Heard you were short." Jacob looked at the boards, put them by the west wall. The men worked until dark. That was the closest the valley came to an apology. Clara accepted it. By early winter, the barn had a roof again. The outer boards were a patchwork of new cedar and blackened old timber. Jacob refused to paint over the scorched beams. "Why leave them?" Clara asked. "So nobody mistakes survival for never having burned." She ran her hand along a dark post. That almost sounded poetic. "I'm tired." The first frost came 2 nights later. Clara woke before dawn to find the pasture white along the edges. The windmill creaked softly instead of screaming. Jacob was already in the barn checking the youngest calf. When he returned, his breath smoked in front of him. "Spring held overnight," he said. "Good. North trough froze. Not good. Already broke it. Then good again." He stood on the porch looking at the pale valley. Clara handed him coffee. They drank without speaking. After a while, Jacob reached into his coat. The wooden lark lay in his palm. Clara looked at it. The chipped wing was gone. In its place was a narrow piece of fresh cedar fitted so closely into the old wood that only the color revealed the repair. She took the bird carefully. "You fixed it." "Mostly." She turned it over. The new wing had been shaped with far more skill than the old one. "It doesn't match." "No, the new wing is better." "I had more practice." Clara ran her thumb over the seam. "Why didn't you make both wings new?" Jacob looked at the valley. Then it wouldn't be the same bird. She understood. He had not restored it by erasing the old cuts. He had made room for the damaged part and added strength where it was needed. Clara held it toward him. "You keep it." He shook his head. "I made it for you. You carried it longer than I did." "I carried the idea." She looked down at the bird. "Then where does it go?" Jacob glanced toward the house. "The mantel." Clara smiled. "It fell from there once. I'll fix the shelf." Of course he would. They placed the lark on the mantel that evening. Jacob repaired the shelf first. The translation ledger changed too. For years it had been a record of losses: removed families, altered claims, broken agreements, stolen livestock, missing water, names of men the law had failed to stop. Now Jacob began adding different pages: cattle breeding dates, fence repairs, rainfall, the depth of the North Spring seed orders. A list of families who might need copies of older survey records when the Vance investigation reached court. Clara read over his shoulder one night. "You wrote, 'Replace kitchen roof before monsoon.' It leaks. One corner leaks. The roof leaks. You are expensive to own land with." He looked up. "You bought nails twice this month without writing them down." Clara stared. "You checked?" "Partnership." She pointed at the ledger. "Write that you're irritating." He dipped the pen. "Already recorded." She laughed and sat across from him. The kitchen smelled of salt pork, coffee, and cedar smoke. Wind moved softly against the repaired latch. The lamp flame did not shake much. Jacob's hand moved across the paper. Clara watched the page fill with things that had not happened yet. Spring planting, a second trough, 3 replacement heifers, a roof extension on the east side of the barn. He left a blank line beside house repairs. Clara pointed at it. "What's that for?" "Your decision." "Our decision." He corrected the heading. She watched him do it. A small thing, 1 word. But after months of men trying to change her life by changing words on paper, Clara understood exactly what that correction meant. 2 days before Christmas, the territorial clerk returned with permission to search the sealed Vance house. Clara had almost forgotten the rusted key. Jacob had not. They rode to the North Ridge with Sarah and Miller shortly after sunrise. Frost still held in the shaded ruts. The Vance house stood silent behind its iron gate, shutters closed, veranda empty. Without Silas's horses, servants, and constant movement, the place looked less grand than Clara remembered. It looked like lumber and stone arranged to make other people feel small. Miller broke the county seal on the front door. "Official search," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Inside, the room smelled of cold ashes, furniture polish, stale cigar smoke, and the faint sourness of a house shut too long. Clara had expected luxury. There was some velvet chairs, framed prints from New York, a silver tea service no one in the valley needed. But the rooms were darker than they appeared from outside. Jacob did not look at any of it. He walked toward the rear hall as if following a line only he could see. Sarah pointed to a narrow door beneath the staircase. "My father said the cellar stairs were moved when Harlan built over the old foundation." Miller tried the latch, locked. Jacob removed the rusted key. For the first time since Sarah gave it to him, his hand shook visibly. Clara stood beside him but did not touch him. He put the key into the lock. It resisted. He turned harder. Something inside the mechanism scraped, caught, then released with a deep metal click. Sarah covered her mouth. "My father told the truth," she whispered. The door opened on stone steps descending into darkness. Miller lit a lantern. They went down one at a time. The cellar walls were older than the house above. Clara could see it immediately. The stones were rough set, not the squared blocks used in the Vance construction. Near the bottom step, a beam had been cut away but not removed completely. Jacob ran his fingers over it. 2 sets of initials had been carved into the wood, A.B.R.B. Amos and Rebecca Blackwood. Jacob closed his eyes. Clara looked away to give him privacy in a room that had once belonged to his family. The cellar held wine racks, empty crates, coal bins, and shelves of preserves gone black with age. They searched the floor for the place Sarah's father had described. Nothing. Miller tapped stones with the handle of his lantern. Sarah examined the wall near the old beam. Clara noticed a square of floor that stayed dry while the surrounding stone showed damp. Here, Jacob knelt. The stone shifted under his knife. Together, he and Miller pried it up. Beneath was a cavity lined with rotted cloth. Inside sat a tin document box. The hinges had rusted shut. Jacob did not open it immediately. He stared at the box as if it might contain something more dangerous than paper. Clara crouched beside him. "Whatever is in there already happened," she said. He nodded. Miller used a small pry bar on the latch. The metal broke. Inside were deeds, tax receipts, 2 letters, and a folded survey map protected between sheets of oilcloth. The first deed carried Amos Blackwood's name. The second listed Thomas Whitlock as a boundary witness. Clara sat down hard on the cold floor. There it was. Not memory, not gossip. Not a story told under breath because powerful men preferred another version. Paper. The kind of proof men like Silas had always demanded from people they assumed would never be able to produce it. Jacob read the first page without speaking. His father's signature was uneven and strong. The ink had faded brown, but the name remained. Sarah began crying quietly. "My father should have brought this out." Jacob looked at her. He was afraid. "That doesn't excuse him." "No." Sarah wiped her face. Jacob folded the deed carefully, but it explains how silence survives. Miller stood near the wall, pale in the lantern light. "My grandfather was here that night." Jacob looked at him. Miller swallowed. "I grew up hearing that the Blackwoods left because they chose the mountains. I never asked why the story changed depending on who told it." Jacob placed the papers back into the tin box. "You can ask now." Miller nodded. On the way out, Jacob stopped beneath the carved beam. He put his palm over his father's initials. Then he took out his knife. Clara thought he might cut the beam free. Instead, he carved one small mark beside the old letters. Not his name. A simple bird with spread wings. The shape was rough, deliberately rough, Clara smiled. "You've gotten worse." Jacob slid the knife away. "I had cold hands." They carried the tin box into daylight. The winter sun hit the old metal and made it shine in places where rust had not eaten through. Jacob locked the cellar again before they left. He kept the key. Not because he wanted the house, because this time the door had opened for him. The legal hearing over the Blackwood Ridge came in January. Jacob did not attend in an army coat. He wore a plain dark shirt, a good wool jacket Clara had traded for at Finch's, and the same boots he used in the barn. The rusted key sat in his pocket. Sarah testified, so did Miller. Old survey notes were read into the record. The scorched ledger page was examined. The county produced tax rolls showing Harlan Vance had begun paying on the ridge only after the Blackwoods were removed. No document could return Jacob's father, mother, or childhood. No judge could make the theft clean by reversing it. The court restored a portion of the original claim to Jacob and ordered the disputed spring held jointly with the Whitlock parcel according to the partnership deed. Silas's house remained under court seizure until broader claims were resolved. When the clerk asked Jacob whether he intended to take possession of the house, he said no. "What do you want done with it?" the clerk asked. Jacob looked at Clara, then at Sarah. "Sell the structure. Use my portion to compensate families whose claims were altered by the Vances." The clerk removed his spectacles. "All of it?" Jacob nodded. Clara did not interrupt. On the ride home, she asked, "You're sure?" "Yes." "You could have kept the money. I kept the land. You could have kept both." Jacob looked toward the mountains. "I've spent enough years carrying things that belonged to dead men." Clara understood he did not mean property. They rode on. By February, wild mustard appeared near the creek. The first green seemed almost indecent after so much brown. Clara planted onions again where Silas's horse had crushed the old row. Jacob built a low fence around the bed so cattle would not destroy them. Silas managed it without being cattle, she said. Some animals are harder to fence. She looked at him. That was almost a joke. I'm improving. One evening they sat on the porch after supper while rain moved far off over the mountains. Not near enough to help, near enough to smell. Jacob leaned back against the post. Clara's shoulder touched his. Neither moved away. After a while he said, I used to think coming home would feel bigger. How? Trumpets. A sign. Something. Clara looked at the yard. A chicken scratched beneath the water barrel. One hinge on the barn door squeaked. Their oldest cow was chewing a piece of rope she should not have been able to reach. This is disappointing? Jacob watched the cow. No. They sat longer. The rain smell faded. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. Jacob went still. She almost moved away. Then his hand settled over hers on the porch board. His palm was rough and warm. No promise was spoken. Neither needed one. The next morning he moved his bedroll from the porch into the spare room. Clara noticed. She said nothing. 2 nights later he carried it back outside after waking from a bad dream. She said nothing then either. A week after that he slept inside again. Home, Clara learned, was not one return. It was a series of small permissions. A cup left on the table because someone would use it in the morning. A coat on a second peg. 2 sets of muddy boots by the door. A ledger written in plural. A repaired bird on the mantel. When the first strong spring wind came down the valley, the windmill groaned. Clara went outside with her wrench. Jacob followed carrying the grease bucket. I can do it, she said. I know. Then why are you coming? Because the tower sways. It has always swayed, I know. She put 1 boot on the first rung. Jacob took the bucket handle. Clara looked at him. You're not climbing ahead of me. I wasn't planning to. You're also not telling me where to put my feet. I remember how this conversation ends. She climbed. Jacob followed several rungs below. At the top, the valley opened beneath them. The pasture was still mostly brown, but threads of green ran along the creek. The rebuilt barn stood dark and solid beside the house. The north spring caught sunlight like a piece of glass. Farther out, where the Vance house waited under court seal, the land looked no different from anywhere else. No property line could be seen from the windmill, only ridges, water, grass, sky. Clara tightened the hub bolt. Jacob greased the bearing. The blades began to turn smoothly. Water knocked through the pipe below. Clara leaned against the iron frame and looked across the valley. 15 years, she said. Jacob rested one hand on the rung beside hers. Yes, you took your time. I got lost. She looked at him. His face was older, scarred, and completely unlike the boy in her charcoal drawings. It was also his. Clara smiled. You found it. Jacob looked toward the porch. No, he said. We built it. Below them the windmill turned, the pump worked, and the trough began filling one steady stroke at a time. That evening, Clara took the old charcoal drawings from the false bottom drawer where she had hidden them years ago. She spread them on the kitchen table. Jacob stared at the first one. That is supposed to be me? You had worse hair. My head is enormous. You needed room for songs. He looked at her. For a second, neither spoke. Then both began laughing. The sound filled the kitchen and went out through the open window into the cooling dark. Later, after the lamp was turned low, Jacob opened the translation ledger to a clean page. He wrote the date. Under it he wrote, North wind strong, windmill repaired, spring running clear, cattle healthy. Clara planted onions too early and will deny it when they freeze. Clara leaned over his shoulder. Give me that pen. He covered the page with one hand. Official record. False statement. Witnessed personally. She reached for the pen. He moved it out of reach. She caught his wrist. He laughed. The lark watched from the mantel, one old wing and one new wing casting a crooked little shadow against the wall. Outside, frost silvered the sagebrush. The ranch was not safe from drought. It was not safe from winter, bad prices, illness, broken fences, or the 1,000 ordinary disasters that came with choosing to stay anywhere difficult. Clara knew that. Jacob knew it better. But the land no longer felt like a thing they had to defend alone from every direction. It felt like work shared between 2 people who understood its cost. Before going to bed, Clara checked the stove, barred the back door, and lowered the lamp. Jacob checked the front latch out of habit. Then he stopped. He looked at his hand resting on the wood. Clara waited. Slowly, he let go without testing it a second time. They walked down the hallway together. The house settled around them with an ordinary creak. Jacob did not turn back. On the mantel, the repaired lark stood beneath the window where morning light would find it first.